Achnacarry Castle, the Scottish Highlands, April 4, 1942. Rain hammers the granite walls and turns the training ground to black mud. A line of exhausted men stands in the dark, rifles slung, breath fogging in the cold. Somewhere ahead, an instructor's voice cuts through the downpour, flat and unhurried, the way a man speaks when he has done something 1,000 times and expects it to be done correctly the first time. In his hand is a slim, double-edged blade no longer than a table knife, its handle ridged like a rugby ball, its point tapered to something closer to a needle than a weapon. He does not raise his voice. He simply demonstrates again the short upward thrust beneath the ribs, the twist, the withdrawal. Then he hands the knife to the man nearest him and tells him to do it to a hanging carcass of meat. This is not theater. Within weeks, some of the men in that line will be dropped into occupied Norway, France, and the Low Countries, where this 6-inch piece of steel may be the only weapon they can carry silently, the only one that makes no sound and needs no ammunition, the only one built for a single, brutal purpose, to kill a sentry before he can raise the alarm. This is the story of the Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife, and it matters because very few objects this small have ever been so deliberately, so scientifically designed to end a human life in under 2 seconds. To understand why the British Army needed such a thing, you have to look at what a soldier of 1940 actually carried. The standard-issue bayonet, an 18-inch spike designed to be fixed to the end of a rifle, was a weapon of the trenches, built for the shoving match of set-piece infantry battles, not for a man moving alone through hedgerows at 3 in the morning. It was heavy, it was long, it clanked against webbing, and it was utterly unsuited to close quarters, silent killing. After the catastrophe of Dunkirk in June 1940, with the British Army stripped of most of its heavy equipment and the whole of Western Europe under German occupation, Winston Churchill demanded a force capable of striking back where conventional armies could not reach. He wanted, in his own words, specially trained troops of the hunter class, who could land on hostile shores and cause continuous disruption. That order created the Commandos, and it created an entirely new category of problem. How do you train a soldier to kill silently, at arm's length, in the dark, against a man who may be twice his size without giving away his own position with a gunshot? The existing British service knives, adapted trench tools, and pocket clasp knives among them, simply were not designed to answer that question. Some had blades too short to reach vital organs through winter clothing. Others had handles that turned in a sweating palm at the critical moment. None had been designed from first principles around human anatomy and the physics of a killing thrust. The problem, in short, was not a lack of knives. Britain had plenty of knives. The problem was the complete absence of a knife engineered specifically to kill a man in silence, in seconds, on the first attempt, because a soldier who failed on the second attempt might not get a third. There was also a deeper, less obvious problem, one rooted in training rather than hardware. The British Army of the interwar years had spent almost no time preparing officers or ordinary soldiers for the psychological reality of killing a man at arm's length with a blade. Formal combat doctrine assumed distance, assumed rifles and artillery, assumed that death was delivered from yards or miles away rather than inches. Sentries guarding coastal batteries, radar stations, and headquarters buildings across occupied Europe stood only feet from the men sent to silence them, and the raiding parties tasked with reaching those sentries could not simply improvise their way through that encounter. They needed both a tool and a doctrine built for it, something that removed the need for a soldier to invent, in the panic of the moment, a technique nobody had ever taught him. Without that combination, raids risked collapsing at the first point of contact, an alarm raised, a struggle heard, an entire operation, and the lives attached to it lost in the space of a few seconds of noise. That is the scale of the challenge the Commandos faced heading into 1941. Not simply how to arm a soldier, but how to manufacture, in a matter of months, the confidence and precision that police officers like Fairbairn-Sykes had spent 30 violent years in Shanghai acquiring by accident. The men who solved that problem were not conventional weapons designers. William Ewart Fairbairn and Eric Anthony Sykes had spent the best part of 3 decades in the Shanghai Municipal Police, working the most violent waterfront district in the world during the 1920s and 1930s, a city of warlords, opium gangs, and street violence so routine that officers there were said to see more armed confrontations in a single year than most soldiers saw in a lifetime. Fairbairn, in particular, had been stabbed, shot, and beaten nearly to death in the course of his police work, and had responded by studying Chinese martial arts, founding Shanghai's own riot squad, and developing a close combat system he called Defendu, built entirely around speed, surprise, and anatomical precision rather than strength or size. When war broke out, the pair were brought back to Britain and installed as instructors at a secret training establishment at Camp X in Canada, and later at the Commando Depot at Achnacarry, tasked with turning ordinary young men into operatives capable of killing silently within arm's reach of an enemy. Existing knives frustrated them immediately, so in late 1940 they worked with the Wilkinson Sword Company in London to design one from scratch, working backwards from the human body itself. They studied where the major arteries and organs sat beneath the ribs and in the throat, calculated the depth of tissue a blade needed to penetrate to reach them quickly, and built the entire knife around that single number. The result, standardized into what became known as the Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife, looks almost nothing like a soldier's clasp knife or a hunting blade. It is roughly 7 inches long overall, with a blade of about 6.5 inches, narrow, symmetrical, and tapered to a fine stiletto point rather than a broad cutting edge, because Fairbairn and Sykes had concluded that a thrusting wound to a vital organ disabled an opponent far faster and more reliably than a slashing cut, which a determined man could sometimes absorb and keep fighting through. The handle is where the real engineering shows itself. Cast in ridged, bulbous sections that Wilkinson sword workers nicknamed the Coke bottle grip, it is shaped so precisely that a soldier's hand naturally locates the correct thrusting position even in pitch darkness, wearing gloves, with adrenaline making fine motor control almost impossible. Picture trying to find the light switch in an unfamiliar room in the dark. The ridges of the handle work the same way, guiding the hand by feel alone. The whole knife weighs barely 150 grams, lighter than a smartphone, yet balanced so precisely along its length that it could be driven forward with the full weight of a lunging body behind it. Early versions were manufactured with a blued or blackened finish specifically to prevent any reflective glint giving away a man's position on a moonlit beach or riverbank, a detail as deliberate as everything else about the design. Production ramped up at Wilkinson Swords Acton Works in West London through 1941 and 1942, and later at other contractors including Camillus and later manufacturers in the United States once American forces adopted variants of the design, though exact wartime production figures remain difficult to pin down with certainty, since much of the paperwork surrounding commando and special operations executive equipment was deliberately kept sparse or was later destroyed. Estimates, drawn from surviving contract records, suggest hundreds of thousands were produced across the war, though the true figure across all pattern variations may never be known precisely. The knife also evolved considerably as the war progressed, a fact often lost in popular accounts that treat it as a single, unchanging design. The earliest pattern, often called the first pattern, featured a langet, a small crosspiece at the base of the blade, and a relatively delicate ricasso that some armorers found prone to snapping under the stress of a hard thrust. Feedback from operatives in the field, gathered informally through instructors like Fairbairn who remained close to the men actually using the weapon, fed almost immediately back into production. The second pattern, appearing from around 1941, simplified the crossguard and thickened the blade near the handle for durability. The third pattern, the version most associated with the knife in popular memory and the one produced in by far the greatest numbers from 1943 onward, further reinforced the blade root and introduced a broader, chunkier ricasso designed explicitly to survive the twisting motion Fairbairn taught as part of the killing technique itself, since a blade that snapped mid-thrust could leave a soldier both unarmed and exposed at the worst possible moment. This iterative relationship between battlefield feedback and factory redesign, unusual for a piece of equipment as small and seemingly simple as a knife, is itself a quiet testament to how seriously the project was taken at the highest levels of commando training. Training with the knife was as ruthless as its design. At Achnacarry and at the SOE's secret schools scattered across the Scottish Highlands, recruits drilled the same handful of movements until they became reflex rather than thought. The silent approach from behind, the hand clamped hard over the mouth to prevent a scream, the blade driven up and in beneath the rib cage or across the throat in a single motion, then withdrawn and the body lowered silently to the ground rather than allowed to fall and make noise. Fairbairn taught that hesitation was the only real danger, that a man who paused to consider the morality of the act in the moment of contact was a man who would very likely be the one who did not walk away. Documented accounts of the knife's actual battlefield use are understandably thin. Sentry killings by their very nature leave few witnesses and even fewer written reports, and much of the Special Operations Executive's operational record in occupied Europe remains fragmentary or was never filed at all. What does survive suggests the knife saw use in Norway during commando raids on German-held ports, among French resistance cells supplied covertly by the SOE, and in the jungles of Burma and Malaya, where Chindit and other special forces units operated deep behind Japanese lines. Its psychological effect appears to have outstripped even its physical one. German and Japanese forces facing British-trained irregulars developed a genuine dread of silent night attacks, and captured training manuals and interrogation reports occasionally reference fear of the commando knife, specifically, separate from fear of commando raids in general, suggesting the weapon itself had become a kind of symbol. The knife was never intended to be a soldier's primary weapon, and this is a point worth dwelling on because it explains much of what followed. It was a tool of last resort and first contact, carried alongside a silenced pistol, a Sten gun, or, in the case of SOE agents operating deep in occupied territory, no other weapon at all beyond what could be concealed under civilian clothing. Its role was to solve the specific tactical problem of the sentry, the guard dog handler, the lone patrolman standing between a raiding party and its objective, a problem that could not be solved with gunfire without alerting an entire garrison. In that narrow but recurring situation, across raids on Norwegian fjords, German-held Channel Islands, and later operations supporting the French resistance in the run-up to and aftermath of D-Day, the knife appears again and again in the surviving fragments of operational reporting, not as the weapon that won battles, but as the one that made it possible to begin them undetected. If you're finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think, so do consider it before we carry on. Germany fielded nothing quite equivalent. German Fallschirmjäger and other special units carried gravity knives and various fighting daggers, including the well-known SS and Luftwaffe pattern blades, but these were generally derived from hunting or utility knife traditions. Broader bladed and designed as much for status and general field use as for the specific anatomical purpose the Fairbairn-Sykes was built around. American forces, recognizing the value of the British approach, adopted their own derivative, the V-42 stiletto issued to the 1st Special Service Force, which borrowed heavily from the Fairbairn-Sykes profile but added a thumb rest along the spine of the blade and a slightly heavier build suited to American training doctrine. Later in the war, the U.S. Marine Corps commissioned the K-bar fighting utility knife, a broader, more robust blade that reflected a different philosophy entirely, one that valued a knife capable of both combat and general camp use over one built purely for silent killing. The comparison is telling. Where German and later American designs tended to compromise between combat and utility, Fairbairn and Sykes refused to compromise altogether. Their knife could not chop wood, could not easily open a tin, could barely be used for anything except the single task it was built for, and that single-mindedness is precisely what made it so effective at that task. The design proved influential enough that variants and near copies were produced by numerous nations after the war, and elements of its ergonomic thinking, particularly the idea of shaping a handle to guide the hand by feel rather than sight, quietly influenced military and police knife design for decades afterward. Assessing the true impact of the Fairbairn-Sykes knife honestly requires separating what can be proven from what can only be inferred. Materially, it is likely that only a relatively small number of enemy soldiers were ever actually killed with the blade itself, since firearms, explosives, and unarmed combat techniques accounted for the overwhelming majority of Commando and SOE casualties inflicted on the enemy across the war.